Woman literally calls herself the step monster-in-law. Lives up to it heavily. Author is mentioned in the description. Okay, so slightish background story. My husband is an amazing man. I love to pieces and would do anything for this big lug nut. Both his mom and dad were the typical Mormon followers who were amazing to me from the start. Unfortunately for us, mom passed away on Dec. 23 of 2014. Skip forward to about a year. Please don't send hate about my dad. He was in grief and told us all the time how he would never let this woman in his home given a chance again. My dad found a supposed friend of the family, who we all agreed seemed very nice at first. Few red flags from the start in my and my husband's opinion. Currently in the middle of divorcing another man, who had custody of 3 of their children, one not even biologically his child. This divorce was found out to be filed by the husband because she abused him and their children and was a big abuser of drugs. It was clear from first meeting her that she had some severe issues mentally. My husband and I naturally got strange vibes from this woman. We ignored our signs, trying to be friendly because we are, hopefully, good people, and wanted to hear her out. From the start, she continued to force things into my dad's head, like, we are never getting married unless you buy me a dog first. I will never take the place of your mother, wife. If this is going to work between us, we can't tell the church about our sins. Things we naturally brushed off because it seemed like she was playing around. No, in the time we knew her, she forced my dad to get a golden retriever pup, which she got rid of because, despite not having a job or anything to do all day, she didn't want to take care of it because I can't handle the smell of dog poop. It makes me vomit, a comment frequently used with her. Because my dad worked 12+ hours to keep the roof over their head, and my brother-in-law did not want to care for the dog. Even going so far as to tell her he refused to take care of a dog he never wanted or got. Acceptable as well when you know that he works night shift in a town a half-hour away. After getting rid of this sweet dog, because she would never be able to care for her, Monster then proceeded to force my father to get 2 smaller dogs that, again, no one would care for. Later she eventually bred these dogs claiming that they would raise money for charity, but scammed people's money and kept it all for herself. Yeah, hatred cannot express how I felt about her. She also smoked weed, which my husband and I never cared about, but made it very clear to her and my father that I could not be around it. I am highly allergic to tobacco and weed. However, the longer she stayed, the more it became an issue for her. The monster would proceed to do all of the following regularly. Call and leave threats on my phone and my husband's phones. Yell and shout, starting arguments with no rhyme or reason, and even force my dad to stay away from family functions because your mother and sister will force us to get a divorce. Please note this is summarized. At one point, when we found out that I was pregnant with my first daughter, we planned the baby shower to be on my mother's actual mother-in-law, namesake for the baby, birthday because it happened to fall perfectly on Saturday. Because she couldn't make it to the event, she said she would instead host a small party for anyone who couldn't make it. Refused to invite anyone on my side of the family or my husband's mother's side of the family. Refused to invite anyone male because it was inappropriate despite my discussion about how I don't want it segregated because I want FAMLY to be there, not just the women. Brutally harassed my mother over FB Messenger, claiming that we were splitting up the family by having our baby shower, which I remind you was first and planned by both my husband and I to celebrate my mother's life through a new baby. Then proceeded to get angry and yell at me when a few men, like 2, came to the party outside my husband and father-in-law. Get upset that my mother never came to her baby shower after harassing and making horrible accusations towards her all over social media. Right before my fabulous firstborn was here, she tried to ask me if she could be in the room with me while she was being born. I politely declined, after all the terrible things she had done up to that point, and frankly did not want her there because of her highly agonizing temper, which I knew would only make things worse. I only wanted my mother and husband there for the birth. She had a massive blowout about the way we wanted people to come in. Got angry because they waited for so long. Ugh, it's birth, not magic. Then proceeded to berate my father-in-law every chance she got. After the fact, we had my daughter, and she was growing strange rashes all over only when we were at their house. While bringing this up to Monster, she tried to turn it into a pity party. Few things to note here. A. We told her we did not feel comfortable with her watching our daughter without someone else there. She had been claiming since the beginning of the year she could drop dead any day because of medical issues, and neither of us wanted our newborn alone with her should that happen. B. The 2 dogs I told you about before. She still never cleaned up after them, and we usually found their feces all over their kennel, with them covered in pee, each time we were over there. C. My daughter was having allergic reactions, and we made it clear that she was not to go over there without one of us present to see what the issue was that was causing it. This woman was notorious for being a liar, as proven on the day before my wedding when she tried to give weed to minors and told them they could have it as long as they don't tell the adults. All of these things she completely disregarded and tried to turn back on us, saying it was because I wouldn't admit that I never liked that she smoked weed. I remind you, I don't care what she did, but I was highly allergic to the point that I would have to go to the hospital on 2 occasions after leaving their house because it lingered inside. However, I love my father and wanted to see him because he was important to me. I told her in my final text that if she wanted to be a part of my daughter's life, she can say to me a time and place that was not their house, and I would happily bring her. Instead, Monster noted this: I cannot bond with something being dangled over my head like a carrot on a stick. My husband was furious, to the point he almost told her and our father they were dropped from our lives, but thankfully I convinced him to keep Dad in the loop. After this incident, she continued to steal my father's phone to text threatening messages to me, my husband, our aunt, and many other people my father knew. Trashed my husband and I and our family all over Facebook. Continued to try and make arrangements for my daughter to be over there when we told her explicitly we would never do that. Even went as far as to claim over social media that I was sexually attracted to my father. His sister was attracted to him. His mother was sexually attracted to him, and many of my father's female friends were attracted to him. We threatened a restraining order if she didn't stop messaging us, blocked all of her social media accounts, and refused all forms of contact. During the divorce, falsely sent my father to jail, lying about him abusing her. BTW, she asked him for sexual favors afterward because she was longing. Despite being abused by him, lied to my father about how he was supposed to care for her. When my father called the therapist and found out what she said was a lie, she then called him and shouted and threatened him for calling her therapist to find out the truth. Has spread lies and slander about my entire family, saying they are devil worshippers and evil, sexual molesters, etc. through my father's previous wedding album, with my mother down a 250 feet well out of jealousy for a dead woman. Stole the tricycle that he bought for our daughter and then threw it in the ditch beside their house. Stole $16,000+ from him. Stole all of the cookware that my mother and father bought together during their marriage. He has receipts to prove they were from his first marriage. Lied to all her friends and family, claiming he was in the wrong. One such lie was to a now good friend of ours, who she told that Dad was cheating on her with his ex-wife. Said friend was never told that wife had been dead for 4+ years at that point. Stalking my side of the family. Tried to lie about the father of my children, claiming I am a whore, by hearing a story about my brother and lying to everyone saying that I was sleeping around. I have only ever slept with one man. All 3 look identical to him, and he couldn't deny them if he tried. Tried to give herself Skepties, spelling probably wrong, after cutting something open on her leg and refused to go to the doctor unless my father drove her to the hospital. Basically trying to force him to be alone in the car with her so she could keep manipulating him and have him arrested again for something he didn't do. And several horrible things that I have tried to block out. My now 3 daughters are living a wholesome life without her in our lives, and my father has never felt happier than he can finally see his family without his wife threatening him or forcing him to stay home at all times. Update 1. Okay you guys, so based on my last one, I had quite a few people who were confused and wanted me to elaborate a few things, which I was just fine with. As mentioned in one of my comments, this woman has done some terrible things to me and my family. And I don't mind talking it out because this is cheaper than therapy. I'm joking, of course, I still go to therapy. Also, I will try to use mother-in-law, father-in-law, and monster more often so I don't confuse people between my parents and in-laws. So here we go. I guess we should start off with how this all came about. So, in my last post, I let everyone know the start was, my husband and I got together, and I got to meet his wonderful parents. Well, their family had a fire on Valentine's Day at the beginning of 2014, which stressed my mill out to the point that she had a heart attack after moving into their newly built home at the end of the year. We were all incredibly saddened by her death. No one could ever explain to me how I knew this woman for less than a year, and it hurt so badly to lose her. I remember pulling up to my husband's home at the time, tears in my eyes, as I embraced my husband and begged him to tell me that everything was all right. He held me so tight and whispered through startled breaths that she was gone. He had found her lifeless body that morning. When my father-in-law, came home, my husband rushed to his side and tried to tell him that his mother was gone. We later found out how incredibly devastating this was for my Phil because this was the only morning he was late and forgot to kiss his wife goodbye. She was prone to sleeping on the couch because of medical problems and not in her bed. I cannot stress the pain that man must have felt. They got married very young and had been together for at least 30 years at that point. My Phil shoved my husband to the side, not very hard, and raced for the door. When you walk inside, it is nothing but sadness and pain. Nothing more heartbreaking than watching my father in his chair, crying in agony, begging for God's help, and just trying to figure out what he is going to do without her in his life. I will explain this part in detail, simply because if more people request stories about Monster, there is another part to this that will come back later to make you hate this woman as much as we did. Anyway, about a year later, my Phil was still heavily grieving. It was so bad, he had forgotten how to smile. You could never tell what hit him the wrong way, and most of the time, we found him watching TV, then going to work, going to church, and coming home to watch more TV and sleep. He always had his son sticking around, and it was extremely hard for me at this point, because my husband and I had been talking about moving out for some time before this point, and decided that it was now or never. So after he proposed to me on Valentine's Day, I lost my grandfather, who was the biggest death in my life to this day, and we talked it out. My husband and I moved into an apartment. I hated to take my husband away from my Phil, but he was 30 and still living at home, and with us talking about starting a family, it needed to be done. I know that with my husband gone, my Phil was hurting not being around his son as much as he was used to. He was vulnerable, and that was when the monster slithered into existence. I couldn't tell you how she came up. As mentioned before, I don't remember a time that my Phil didn't just work and come home. But, however it happened, she seemed to make him smile again with her silly antics. She was childish and made him feel young. Even now we all wish we could have just convinced him that it was the grief taking over him, and he eventually learned it for himself. Our first ever meeting with this woman was at the house. The only way to describe her was a timid mouse, scurrying about because people came near her. She supposedly suffered from severe anxiety and social problems. I say supposedly because she was a notorious liar, and had a ton of medical issues that she lied about all the time. The meeting was brief, and we hardly got to talk to her if at all. But during that time, Phil explained a few things like this was just a fling, nothing is going to come out of it, and basically convincing himself that it wasn't serious. Until it was. My Phil had two major issues that we didn't know about. This girl was a terrible listener. Yes, she made him feel young and made my Phil smile again for the first time in a while. But this whole arrangement was because he told her that when she took her medication, which was known to make her extremely drowsy, Phil did not want her driving. It was dangerous, reckless, and could have hurt a lot of people, not just her. So he told her that when she took this medication, she could spend the night. However, to her, this meant that she never had to go home. The second issue was my Phil was Mormon, and whether you yourself are religious or not, there are certain rules that you are supposed to follow when you are religious. In the Mormon religion, you could not live in the same house as the opposing sex without being married, or that person being a daughter, son, family of some kind. It was seen as indecent, and a major no-no. My Phil was a pastor. If anyone found out about what happened, he would lose everything that he held dear about his religion. He loved his church, he loved his people, and he didn't want to be seen as something he wasn't because some woman had forced her way into his life. For any of you who may not understand, my Phil is a non-confrontational man. It was so much harder for him to tell her to leave than it was to marry her to keep the peace. Another big part of this was he was missing that connection that he was so used to after all these years. So fast forward a little bit, less than a year, my Phil called us over. I was prone to social anxiety myself, but usually fought through those anxieties to be around family. So if my Phil called my husband, he usually asked me to come along, so he wasn't alone. When we get there, she is sitting in the car, and my Phil is standing outside the car. He asked my husband for his blessings, and immediately, I mean like she was gone in a flash, Monster whipped the seat backwards so she was no longer showing through the window at all. All of us had a brief laugh at her craziness, but it definitely struck a huge flag with my husband and me. My husband's words to him were, if she makes you happy, then don't let me stand in your way. However, going home, my husband relayed to me all of the things he felt unsure or unconfident about. I simply tried to remind him that Phil was an adult and could handle himself. Shortly after this exchange, however, everything was planned for their wedding. Her previous divorce was finalized, and we even helped gather her things. The drive brought another multitude of issues that did not sit well with me, but I remained casual. She told me about why they were getting a divorce in the first place. According to her, her ex-husband was sneaky and did some terrible things to go against her in court. She admitted to being not so good a mother, and on this drive even confessed that she hit her son so hard that he flew across the room at one point. She had apparently held her kids down to the ground to prevent them from getting into fights with their father, and a multitude of other things that seemed off. So trying to be the mediator, I told her that if what she said is true, then her kids will come to see it. This woman was an amazing actress, and her tears are quite good at pulling people into her sob story. But the one thing that popped out to me was her daughter. This daughter was conceived by another man in a previous relationship. Through multiple ways, I found out that she never wanted to see or speak to her mother because of physical, mental, verbal, and drug abuse. And during Monster's time with my Phil, we found out that she even went as far as to send threatening messages from my Phil's phone. My Phil had no idea she had done this either, and when she would explain herself, she would constantly tell us that she didn't know how to properly talk to people over the phone because of her social anxieties. This monster was lazy, combative, a consistent liar, and all kinds of wrong. Again, all things that we had no idea about until it was too late. My brother-in-law, witnessed this firsthand after moving back in with their father, to be there for him when my husband moved out before Monster moved in. During a family camping trip, I was invited by Monster because she did not want to feel like the only girl on a camping trip. I love camping and have since I was much smaller, so I figured it would be a nice breakaway if my husband and other family didn't mind. They didn't. However, when the time came, I was the one who went, as the only girl on this trip. This was one of many times she would try and fake illnesses to get out of things that were not directly planned by her. If this wasn't bad enough, during the entire trip, she would blow up my Phil's phone and try to talk to him as though she wasn't welcomed. At one point, she even got extremely mad that he didn't clean up the house before he left on this camping trip with us. I remind everyone of two things. One, she had no job, no work, and nothing to do all day long but dirty all of the dishes for her baking career. My Phil works 12+ hours in the medical field, at least 5 days a week, sometimes 6, and then came home to her arguing and shouting that he wasn't cleaning up the house. He was also forced to take care of the dog that she wanted, clean all the dishes that she made throughout the day, and do any other manual laboring tasks that she wanted to get done, but would never lift a finger to help. Eventually, her arguing had my Phil drive all the way back home from camping just so they could be together for the night. She was the one who decided not to come to this thing, even after begging me to come along so she had some company. Needless to say, this was another major red flag for us and my husband, and I was not very happy with how she was acting. However, this was still fairly early on in the relationship, and not even the beginning of the torment we would receive. Update 2. So, for anyone keeping up with the story so far, we were just beginning to learn about Ms. Monster. The longer she stuck around, the more we were going to find out about her. And for anyone wondering, by this time in the story, we already had one of the 2 little dogs I mentioned in my previous report. I didn't bring that piece up because it was annoying, but more of an inconvenience to my Phil, if anything, even though he now has one of the said dogs and loves her to pieces. So anyone wondering about the dog thing, basically, Monster refused to marry my Phil until he bought her a dog because her ex-husband had a Doberman that supposedly belonged to her, and she missed her. So to make up for that, she got a golden retriever pup, knowing she wouldn't take care of it. What do I mean by that? Since day one, she would tell people, "I can't clean up poop because the smell makes me vomit." My Bill worked a half hour away from home and worked night shift, so he was asleep most of the day and wouldn't be able nor want to take care of a dog that she wanted. So because of this, knowing my father worked 12+ hours at sometimes 6 days a week, she got rid of the dog. Commendable, but here is the next issue. She got another dog who was smaller and harder to handle, then made my Phil clean after the dog, to the point where we would come over there, and the dogs would be covered in pee and pooped in the kennel multiple times. She refused to take care of them, but let them run around in their feces for 12+ hours, then yelled at my dad to clean after them when he got home from an exhausting medical shift. Shortly after this story, she gets a second dog, similar in the breed to the first, some kind of Yorkie mix, and tried to breed them for profit. Now she posted that she would be using this money to send to charity, but scammed everyone that she gave the dogs to and kept the money for herself. Not sure if she did it to anyone on her side of the family, but the few on our side we managed to talk to told us she told them one amount of money, then kept increasing it multiple times to keep getting money off them. My dad was furious. Yeah, another big pet peeve of mine, but I didn't bring it up in detail, hoping to do a full explanation like this in this part. So thanks for your patience. Anyway, back to the story in part 2. I found out pretty early that my Mill's sister was still on excellent speaking terms with my Phil. The house he was staying in was actually Mill's childhood home. So when she passed away, there were thankfully things kept in the garage that belonged to Mill's sister, jewelry and such. However, because Monster was too scared to ever see Mill's sister, she never allowed her to come over to the house to reclaim said items that my Phil wanted to give back. Flash forward a bit closer to the wedding, and Monster was trying to sell junk in the garage to make money so they could help us with costs for the wedding. You can probably already tell where this is going. I remember her holding the jewelry in her hands, claiming that she wanted to keep them because they were beautiful. Note, by this time, I was never told that the jewelry belonged to anyone. This was found out months later when running into my aunt in a fast food restaurant, by coincidence. She also told me about how Monster never allowed her over because she was scared of meeting her. I can't say that she sold or stole the jewelry because I wasn't there when the sale took place, but I never saw that box of her things ever again. The Monster was also notorious for scam deals. I can't tell you how many cars they bought during their relationship, only to be sold off because they couldn't afford the payments. One such car was a Jeep that she had bought for my Phil's birthday. He was crazy about Jeeps and loved that thing more than anything. However, as soon as he had it, she sold it off, crushing my father even more than he had ever been before. I can still remember one of my husband's cousins coming up to him, he was a child, asking his uncle why he looked so sad all the time. One scam was she wanted to drive her car to the middle of a bad neighborhood and claim fraud, knowing it would get stolen if she left it there. Yeah, this was typical behavior we were coming to find. One such incident actually happened after my wedding, but I will explain it quickly before getting to the actual wedding because it relates. When my husband moved out, my Phil gave him his old Envoy. It wasn't new, it was pretty old and had a few problems here and there that needed fixing, but nothing so severe that my husband wanted to get rid of it. As a matter of fact, he protested the idea to Monster multiple times, but eventually she cracked him, and they went out looking for a new car together. It would be around $2,000–3,000 to fix the Envoy with its latest issue, so they instead chipped in to buy my husband, our current Impala. Problem 1. My husband and I were having a lot of issues financially at this time, and knew we couldn't afford a car payment, even with it only being almost $200.00 a month. One of the critical things brought up to Monster before she broke my poor husband. Problem 2. This car was so small compared to the vehicles my husband grew up driving, and he complained about it constantly when he first got this car. He was used to driving a minivan, a store van, and an Envoy all his life. On top of that, they still shelled out the money to have the Envoy fixed and gave the car to her brother, friend, or whomever. Even worse still, my husband found out not even a day later, the Envoy was totaled by said person and couldn't be used again. We were devastated because now we were stuck with a car that we could barely afford. But thankfully, that part is all taken care of now, and we plan on getting a bigger car for my husband since it is hard to fit 3 kids in one car. So on to the wedding portion. Again, please remember that a ton of things I am about to tell you lied to us from the start, and we didn't find out the truth until so much later when she would snap and shout everything out in a fit of rage. Starting off, she had apparently received a huge sum of money from her family inheritance, or whatever. The story changed so many times. I am talking about over $60K kind of change. We assumed that she was really nice because instead of spending it on a bunch of stuff or saving it to pay off the house, she used it to help fix their yard and fund our wedding. Now I know what you're thinking, but Rose, this is super nice, why would that be a problem? For a couple of reasons, actually, but the main one being what we found out later. This woman, who poured her eyes out, trying to claim that she would do anything to get her children back, full lost custody of all 3. She was so hurt that they were wrongfully taken away from her, and Monster wanted to prove that she loved them more than anything in the world. Well, apparently, the entire reason why she got rid of this money so quickly wasn't to be so lovely. She had student debt and child support that she wasn't paying, and if the IRS caught wind of her money, they would take all of it. I don't know if you work for the IRS, government, or anything, but this is a huge problem. It shouldn't be done. If you have bills, just pay them to get them out of your hair. And what hit me hardest was the child support piece. Coming from a woman who begged, pleaded, and prayed to prove to her kids she loved them, not paying your child support. Now before you get on me about how it was potentially wrong of her to be charged with that in the first place, I remind you the reason she lost her kids was because of her abusive tendencies. And it takes the courts a lot to remove a biological parent from the picture and give that child away to a non-biological parent, with no visitation. Another thing that annoyed me was, wrong or not, you should have enough common sense to understand that child support is supposed to go towards making sure your children are well taken care of. Even if your spouse doesn't use the money for that purpose, it sets a profound message that despite being wronged, You are intentionally making an effort to care for your kids. Child support is one of those things that can help set this message. However, Monster went out of her way to make sure she didn't pay for this. Not exactly Mother of the Year either. She would even try to convince us later that it was because her ex-husband was rich and had plenty of money to care for those kids without her. I again point out that the message behind that funding should be that you want to help your kids, regardless of if you were wronged or not. Monster went out of her way to not pay this. It felt to me like she thought they weren't significant enough to get her help. Later, this also became a huge problem because she tried to use the kindness in her heart to blackmail people, claiming that she should be loved or respected because her money went to helping pay for a portion of the wedding and to fix that backyard. All things no one ever asked her to do, and she even refused money from my mother, who shelled out way more money on our wedding than Monster ever did. Now, a few things: she wanted to do something on the cheap, which I didn't really mind or care about. I personally don't prefer the gaudy style anyway. She claimed that she would grow all of the roses that I wanted for the bouquet instead of letting us just pay for a professional to do them. I had to remind her several hundred times which way I wanted it because of our theme. Personally, I made it as laid back as I could be. We didn't offer a dress code to the people attending, and even the people who were a part of the wedding weren't given strict guidelines. My bridesmaids were all allowed to choose whatever dress they wanted, as long as they stuck to their color. If they weren't comfortable with heels, they wore flats or even tennis shoes to not fall over and hurt themselves. Everything was about being comfortable and coming together for the family, so I didn't mind her constantly telling me that she needed reminding of everything I had told her about before. But the one thing that irked me was my mother, and I worked hard to put together a guest list. There was a lot of family from out of town, and we knew they would need to be invited to the dinner party beforehand. So aside from offering money and her help in several situations, all can be proven by their FB messages going back and forth. Monster never accepted help from anyone on my side of the family, let alone my mother, which frustrated us come the time of the party because she made a very hurtful comment about not realizing there would be this many people. My mother sent her the head count on just my side of the family. Why? My favorite part about this was she was trying to make it sound like she was doing everything by herself. All this, despite all the people in and outside of my family who offered their help the entire time. We could have gone to a sit-down restaurant, but there were a ton of people who would be there, and to be frank, I told her how I was more comfortable with a backyard BBQ. Social anxiety in tow, I would prefer family together and not a bunch of strangers. So during our BBQ, she passed out at the grill because she overwhelmed herself with so much stuff to do, then tried to get pity for it by saying that she never had enough help. Another big flag came after my mother, and another patron of the BBQ told me what they had heard her say during the BBQ. She invited a few of her friends to this, which we didn't mind because they were lovely people. However, said person brought along her children, and anyone who read my comments before knows where this is going. After passing out, she went into the covered back porch to smoke weed for her anxiety. The kids had gone into the covered patio, for whatever reason was unknown, probably to enter the house. But what people heard her tell these kids was astonishing. She was so high, she said to these kids, who at least 2 were under the age of 18, to take her medicinal weed and smoke it behind the garage. Just don't tell the adults. Her trust in me was broken since hearing this from not only a woman I trust with my life, but a family member I had only just met at that wedding from my husband's side of the family. I was appalled. I don't know what their parents do in their free time, and it is not my place to judge, but my biggest fear was this. I want children at this point. If I ever let her watch them by herself, what will she give to them or make them do, and then convince them that I shouldn't know about it? I was petrified. I had a few strange thoughts about this woman by this time, but never so bad that I would consider not trusting her. The biggest kicker was the honeymoon. This was the most uncomfortable conversation with this woman I think that I have ever had in my life. Now, most anyone reading this should surely know what the honeymoon is meant for, mainly for 2 lovebirds who have been together for 5+ years at this point and wanted to start a family. It is not something that you take family trips on. But that is exactly what she kept trying to offer. Yeah, during this time, my husband and I already decided on going camping, which, as previously stated, was a huge love of ours. We could watch the endangered eagles' nests, raft out on the lake, fish, hike, and do many things that we loved doing together. However, this was not clear to Monster-in-law. To start off, she wanted to just pay for plane tickets for a few of us to go off to Vegas and get hitched. Something I had told my parents and the in-laws that I was not comfortable with. My mother, aunt, and a few other people I know had done it this way. None of their relationships turned out okay. And not to say that all relationships doing this are bad, but there is a reason they say what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. I was a bit more traditional than this and genuinely wanted a normal-ish wedding, including more family because we were big on including people. After shooting this highly uncomfortable option down 3 times with this woman, she then tried to proceed to honeymoon ideas. I don't know about you, but the idea of staying in the house with a bunch of families while you are trying to get to baby making is not my cup of tea. Yet, at least 3 times a month, she would tell us that instead of going camping, which we already prepared for by this point, we should go out of state and spend with her family. As creepy as it was that she kept pushing it on us, we held firm and told her no. And after enough times of telling her no, she even tried to guilt trip us into going with her anyway. Even brought it to the point that she turned it into an argument at this point. Like, what? I had never been so confused in my life, and as my husband, I am a semi-non-confrontational person. So having these talks with her was not only annoying but utterly disrespectful to us that she wasn't willing to listen to what we wanted for our honeymoon. We thankfully didn't talk much with her during the honeymoon. And again, like the fools, we assumed she was just having a bad week or something. But from here, the lies started to become apparent, and everything was put into perspective. The straw that broke the camel's back was my daughter. Update 3. So you've heard about her sickening display of not caring for people's personal spaces and clearly having no problem doing whatever she wants because she thinks that she is above the law or something. But here is the part that made even my husband and I completely stop talking to this woman altogether, my daughter. So, the wedding went about as well as it could be, aside from Monster's weirdo display of rolling down a grassy hill in her wedding dress and crawling all over the reception floor to throw cake at a child. My husband and I got our groove on at the honeymoon and realized shortly after that it was not needed. When we came home, I was feeling strange and not in my usual ways, but I was scared of so many issues during pregnancy, being overweight, and having a lot of trauma dealt to me growing up, with bullying and such. I was afraid I would never conceive. It even became a big point during the honeymoon, when I cried to my husband about my fears. Thankfully, when we got home that following week, we found out via a beautiful pink double line that I had actually been pregnant since my husband's birthday, a few weeks before the wedding. We were ecstatic, and as the paranoid person I was, I can't tell you how many of those tests I kept taking each week to make sure the baby was real. Yeah, serious fears. But this is where things started to get serious with Monster. After telling everyone about the baby, we were so happy to welcome this warm bundle into our lives, and everyone got in on it. The family was super stoked. Even my grandmother, who wasn't the most thrilled about having us as grandkids, seemed to be enjoying the idea of having a great-grandchild. But then the financial crisis came. We stayed in an apartment complex during this time, which was pretty strict about the dog rules. I already had a 1011-year-old beagle at this time, but my heart is proudly on my sleeve. I was going on one of my regular walks when I found an abandoned dog out in the rain on the side of the road. Tried everything to find an owner for the poor baby and eventually found out that his owner abandoned him. We tried to get him settled in as an emotional support dog because he was outstanding from the start about figuring out when I was about to pass out. But the apartment complex had lied to me about certain information. When bringing it up to my landlords, if you will, one woman told me quite early that it would be no problem to handle all the stressful paperwork that I would have to go through. When I get this stuff done, I do it legit, not just online. Besides, the dog looked a lot like a pit, despite being a boxer mix with no pit bull in him. I have no problem with the breed, but my state has a huge issue in many of our closer cities with this breed. Most apartments would refuse him if they ever saw his face, which was required by a picture to let them in at all. So unless I had him tested, I did not. At this point, they wouldn't let us live there. Only later were we told by another employee that they wouldn't let us continue our lease if we kept our pup. So we needed to find a place to live in under a month. Yeah, last second notice much. They didn't even care when I told them we were misinformed about keeping him until the forms were done to approve his service needs. We were practically homeless at this point, and I was nervous, to say the least. My parents lived in a tiny hole in the ground. Walls were coming apart in the basement. It was moldy, mildewy, and many other things. Another big issue was they smoked. Yeah, wanted to know where my allergic reactions came from. They developed over time due to being in a house full of secondhand smoke. I have had breathing problems all my life, and my doctor even went as far as to tell me that may have been why. It makes family functions hard, but we always are outside when with my parents to stay with them. But please don't get me started on the precautions we take. It was hard. That is all I am willing to say. So back on track with the story, the only place we had left to go was one of two places. A good friend of mine offered for us to stay with her in a trailer, or my Phil's 2-bedroom story house, recently built and had a spare bedroom and basement that were both perfectly usable for a 2-month stay, tops. So here is where Monster lies about everything to everyone she talks about. This was the first genuine time that we begged for help. My Phil was fine with us staying there. We offered to pay for food, rent, and even clean the house up during our stay. We weren't willing to make asses of ourselves when we were inconveniencing them. His only stipulation was that it had to be okay with Bill and Monster. Bill gives us the green light right away. Laid back, we figured he wouldn't have a problem. However, Monster was another story. Right off the bat, she had questioned everything that we were going to be doing. I told her how we would pay our way. It would be at most for 2 months, and we would just need a spot to lay in. She did not want us upstairs in the spare bedroom because it was the cleanest part of the house and didn't want to ruin that. Alright, no problem. We were comfortable with sleeping in the basement if she would rather. Then comes the part where I could instantly tell she was trying to make up excuses so we couldn't move in. Well, where would the dog stay? I politely tell her that the dog lives in a kennel and wouldn't be a problem for them or their pets since he is currently kennel trained anyway. Our oldest dog was the only one able to stay with my mom because we were already a big enough burden, who would take care of him while we were at work. I let her know that the dog was kennel and potty trained. He was used to being at home alone for most of the day while my husband and I were at work, so no one would have to care for him aside from us. Well, what about at night? Where would he sleep? Being a mama's baby, he was used to sleeping inside the bed with us at night and rarely ever left. If he did decide to get out of bed, we had a baby gate that we could put up for extra precautions. Well, I don't feel comfortable with that idea. Well, he has his kennel, and it would not be a problem for us to put him in the kennel beside us when we sleep. But what would he sleep on? He has a dog bed inside the kennel, but the basement is cold. That little dog bed wouldn't be warm enough. Yeah, so I think what annoyed us the most about this conversation, my parents included because we were eating together at the time of these texts, was how incredibly selfish and rude she was. I was several months pregnant by this time, and instead of outright admitting that she didn't want us there, she continued to fire excuse after excuse as to why she didn't want us there, which irked me so much more when you think about the fact that her last comment was, the dog would be cold in the basement. The dog was going to be really cold outside on the streets this time of year. It was going on September in northern USA. Yet you want to complain to me that you don't want us upstairs behind a solid door, where the dog would be no problem and would have a nice comfortable rug, bed to sleep on. All because you assume we won't clean up after ourselves. I remind you, this was the only time we ever actually begged for help. Any other time, in-laws would claim to offer assistance, but Monster would very sharply tell us following that statement that they were about to lose their home and didn't have a lot of money. Something we never asked for, to begin with, because we were doing pretty well on our own up until that point. We needed shelter to protect us for 1.5 months, to be exact. Thankfully, my friend took us into the 2-bedroom trailer that she was sharing with her friend and friend's son at the time. It was cramped, but we made do. Following October came, and we moved into a new house. I feel it needs mentioning that this was the only time that Monster was ever in our home despite inviting her multiple times. She claimed to help us move into the house, but my husband can attest that she cleaned the toilet for us and maybe the sink in the bathroom, then promptly left to go home and smoke. Not much moving on your part, but Phil and Bill did so much to help get everything ready. I thank them so much for their contributions, be it moving vehicles or moving items into the house. They were so helpful. Not much between us happened after that. We tried our best to honestly avoid Monster from still being quite mad that she was so rude to us before. But in her defense, she did help us make some lovely pre-baby photo shoots for our firstborn. So things seemed to calm down. Then the crazy kicked back up again. During our time in the trailer, Sept-Oct timeframe, my husband and I were planning out the baby shower for our baby. We decided on using Mill's birthday because it was a special day for us. It was also our way of celebrating one life with the birth of another. This made it especially real when we discovered that the baby would be a girl later on and would actually carry my Mill's name. It was a special meaning to us, and we wanted everyone to be there. I made sure that just because it was a baby shower, all the men in my life knew they were invited like any woman. I wanted our baby to know that her family loved her, not just the women of my family. Another reason for this is because that date fell perfectly around my brother's army schedule, and he would be able to come and enjoy his family and new niece as well. In comes Monster. She blatantly tells us multiple times beforehand that she would rather we change the date because they would be out of town that day. BTW, when all was said and done, they never went on their trip. I explained why we had it, and on multiple accounts said that it would not be a big deal if she missed that day because we could just have a small party for them when they got back. Despite disregarding the importance of that day and what it meant to myself and my husband, who was happy to celebrate his mother, she was persistent in getting us to change it. Something that, to this point, has been disregarded because I hated her for it. Until now, anything revolved around my meal was either thrown away or, worse, given to other people. Monster even went so far as to kick my Bill out of the house, despite my Phil not wanting him to leave because he was there to spectate all the terrible things she did in that house. Remember my comment about how I will never replace or get rid of your mother? She said it a lot, but you could tell she made it a point to erase my Mill. On one such event, my brother actually hears her fighting with my Phil. She stole all of his electronics and threatened to throw them all away if he didn't erase all of Mill's voicemails and text messages. My Bill threatened to call the police if she didn't leave him alone and give him back all of his stuff, furious that she was even attempting to make him delete his previous wife. So, here is where things get funny. I was one of the many people she tried to confront, thinking that Bill misheard her. She would cry to me, claiming that it was all about a sexual ordeal, and Bill didn't have any idea what they were talking about. She just wanted him to like her. Funny when you think about how she was the reason he was kicked out of the house in the first place. And without someone in the way, things got so much worse. Her innocent act dropped hard. But back to the baby. So, we were having issues with her trying to force us to move our baby shower during this. I was adamant that I wasn't changing it because of the meaning and value to the family. So instead, she started to change it to have another baby shower that she could go to. It started small. Only the people who couldn't make it to the original baby shower were going to go. Then the problems began to arise. I commented on some of my family to tell them the dates of the baby showers, and Monster made it pretty well advertised that she did not want men at her baby shower. I told her that despite it not being traditional, I wanted to have people there because they were family. She would groan and complain about this fact often, and when the shower came, Monster got so mad that 2 other men aside from my husband and Phil showed up. The Monster was making some seriously twisted and messed up accusations towards my mother, who was already very done with her at this point. Each week, she would call me trying to cry and boo-hoo that my mother and I were trying to split the family apart by having our baby shower instead of just doing hers. I remind you again, the meaning behind my baby shower, not to mention a few other things like 1. No men were even allowed to be at her party, so half the FMLY wouldn't even be there. 2. Monster refused to talk to me about invitations from my side of the family, despite bringing it up multiple times. So my husband's family were the only ones even there to begin with. 3. The fact that the date we had chosen was accepting people incredibly close to this baby, and her date was not. People like my father, brother, cousins, aunt, etc. wouldn't be able to make it, hence why the original date was set far enough in advance that they could schedule around it. But lo and behold, she wanted to make everything about her the millionth time this year. On top of all that, she dared to berate and try to humiliate my mother all over FB, including Messenger and posts, claiming that we were the ones splitting up our family. My mother, obviously furious with her, did not attend her baby shower. The Monster was furious and even rolled her eyes when I told her that she was busy. So frustrated by so many things this woman had done, I was officially done. She would call and complain about things that didn't need my input or never involved me, that she tried to make my problem. She was constantly stressing me out with her terrible schemes, and one really frustrated me because it involved my Phil getting upset with my husband over something he couldn't control. We had just got the house, and money was not very easy to come by. Try as we may, it was hard to get the money together to pay for the car payment on the car Monster knew we didn't want. Then we get a call from Phil. He was trying to apply for a loan that wouldn't go through because the car had not been paid in a few months. Noted, this loan was to pay off the $8,000 that she signed for in a terrible deal that they needed to pay by the end of the month. After we caught the car up, everything was fine, but it was still showing on their report, so the loan wouldn't go through. Now, on the one hand, I understand his frustration with this situation because husband never told him what was going on. However, guess who knew about it the entire time and never told her husband that she was snooping through his mail and hiding documents from him? You guessed it, Monster. I had no idea that my husband was letting the car fall behind because we were in a jam. It wasn't until I received a phone call in the trailer from, you guessed again, Monster. She told me how she found the letter addressed to my dad that he hadn't opened yet. She took the liberty of reading it for him, not telling him, and then letting it go at that. Not to mention my mother, who was allowing us to use her address for mailing. she was also getting these letters. There were 6. The fact that my Phil never got one of those letters was disturbing, to say the least. And when Phil tried to catch her in the act, she pawned it off on my husband, saying that I wanted him to man up and tell you. I only thought at this point, you're complaining that he isn't man enough to tell the truth to his father when he is having a hard time because you wouldn't stop complaining about all the stressful issues you were going through. But you thought it was okay to do the exact same thing while committing a federal crime. Then came the kick in the balls. After all of this, the monster came to me a month or 2 out from my due date. The monster messaged me on FB Messenger asking me about my birth plan. That asked if she could be in the room with me when my baby was born. I politely declined, explaining that I didn't feel comfortable with her there, and the only ones going to be in the room were my husband and mother. Crazy chick then tells me that she would dress up as a doctor to sneak into my delivery room. As if I don't have enough stress about my very first pregnancy as it was. I politely tell her again that I would not be comfortable with that and leave it at that. But rest assured, I informed the hospital staff what she had told me and how nervous I was about what she said to me. They made sure to keep an eye out. Update 4. As lovely as it is to hear a title like this was not the last time we would listen to Monster. Far from it. But at least it was the last time we had to deal with her physically. So the last time we heard about Monster, she was getting really freaky about being at my birth, despite knowing how uncomfortable it made me feel. Between all the stressful situations she put me through and all the times she had clearly shown abandonment towards my husband and I, something was telling me that it was my fault and I should just get along with her. Please note, to this day, I still feel responsible for a lot of the stuff she said, but there are lovely people in my life who have confirmed with me that these are not things I could control or handle. Not to mention all the other people she screws over during this process, making me realize that the issue was her, not me. So it is 1 a.m. on March 18th. My water breaks. After some stress shuffling into a car and an excellent hobble to the doors, where I am wheeled up to the labor unit, my husband starts to let everyone know about Code D. The baby's name began with a D, so obviously, I am stressed and having a ton of medical issues. I was horribly preeclampsia, my blood pressure was through the roof, and I was so nervous about this being my first baby. My mother got to the hospital with my father because she would be back there with my husband and me. I was calming down with both of them there, and the pains weren't quite as bad as I expected, even when we got into the more significant contractions. I even opted out of the medicine at first, thinking I wanted to have this completely natural. However, the nurse put a catheter in me because of the preeclampsia, which caused severe problems. The catheter put so much extra pressure on me during birth that it sent me into painful spasms. They eventually had to give me medicine, but I wouldn't stop jumping around because of the pain, so they couldn't put the needle into my back. After taking the catheter out, the big contractions didn't have me jumping at all, and the nurse looked so shocked. She even asked me, was it hurting that badly? Yeah. Anyway, so one harrowing birth later, and I was on to my next fear. My daughter was bluish, and they couldn't get her to cry at first. My husband was so nervous that he was saying his usual bad jokes to cope, and I was in tears, praying that she would start crying. She did, and they took her to NICU, newborn intensive care unit, for about an hour. But she did great. Now reminder, I am exhausted and have been in labor for almost 24 hours. My water broke just before 1 a.m. and my daughter was born after 5 p.m. So it was a long day. I did not need the added stress that came past 6 p.m. when Monster started more drama. We, my husband and I, had set it up because we wanted the biological grandfathers to come and see their grandbaby first. It had been a long day, and most of them were in the waiting room all this time. Not to mention my aunt had brought her children to see the baby, and they needed to get home ASAP. So our plan was to let the grandfathers in first and then let Monster come in with my brother, aunt, or one of my cousins, so we could get everyone out of there as soon as possible because it was so late. Lo and behold, the only one who had an issue with this was Monster. Everyone who came in was so mad at Monster for the disgusting display in the waiting room. That woman was causing a huge scene and forced my Phil to stay behind, so he would walk with her. This made it hard for things to go smoother. Not to mention that this made things difficult in the long run because the way we set it up was to give the grandparents more time with the baby. But because of her selfishness, my Phil now had the least amount of time with his granddaughter. Because of visiting policies and such, there was only so much time they would each get. And the nurse was bringing them out based on how we told her, so she was pretty appalled with how Monster was acting like a child. I even commented that I don't know if I should even let her in with how she behaved, but decided anyway. Then the weirder comments started to come in. We were all pleased about my daughter's healthy birth, but Monster kept commenting on how long it had taken and why they had to wait in the waiting room for so long. Note, anyone who has not had a child, the most extended recorded birth was 75 days, not hours, days. It is a long process. I would also like to note that he did not shout "she's here" in his text when my husband told everyone. We made it well known that Code D was "Mama is in labor." Another thing, they were there for hours and had plenty of time to leave and get things done if they didn't feel like hanging around. So the fact that she was like pawning this off on us made it super disrespectful, especially when you know how many complications I had while giving birth. It is not magic. The baby doesn't just pop out after you go back there. At least not with your very first birth. Another comment that really had my husband in a twist was when she held my daughter and claimed, "I don't know how it happened, but this baby got some part of my DNA in there." When she left and we had a chance to talk, he expressed how uncomfortable it made him feel that she was trying to put herself into our baby. She was not biologically related to either of us in any way, so it was strange at first. However, what was worse was her repeating this exact phrase multiple times in and out of the hospital. So skip forward to not even 3 weeks out of the hospital. I am still getting used to being a new mother, and my daughter was 3 minutes 4 days away from being 3 weeks old. Noted, multiple people came forward and told us they had no problem babysitting or helping out while I was healing, which I appreciated. However, I was doing okay and needed to get back into the swing of things. We were trying to catch up on a ton of laundry because we only recently bought a washer and dryer of our own and had months backed up. It was not okay. So in comes Monster. We had been going over there every once in a while after my 1-2 week. She didn't feel comfortable coming to our house, assuming because she couldn't smoke her weed because of my allergic reactions. More importantly, we wanted Phil to see her since this baby was so important to him. As mentioned before, several people came and told me that if we should need a babysitter to call. However, Monster took it to an entirely different level at this point. It was going on 8:30 at night and we needed to get home. But we had to go to the store first. Phil makes a comment that they could watch her while we went to the store, and then we could come back to pick her up. We politely declined because we were low on gas and it was late. On top of this, there were several issues that we were not comfortable with. The dogs, yes, both dogs at this point, didn't listen to them at all. One jumped up on people regardless of if they had the baby in their arms, and the other was prone to chewing on the backs of people's heads. Not to mention their high-pitched barks were so aggravating and annoying to anyone, let alone a newborn who was trying to get some sleep because it was late at night. As mentioned, we were low on gas at this time, and driving all the way to the store, coming back, and then driving home would be way out of the way since it was a short distance from the store in our town to our home versus our town to another city for my Phil and then back to our house. The cities were right next to each other, only a 15-minute drive depending on traffic, but it was still out of the way. Finally, my Phil didn't have baby equipment over at their house. The closest they had was an elephant rocker for furniture. We were out of diapers in the diaper bag, all but like 2, and her rag was covered in spit up. Not to mention they had no formula, and she just sucked down her last bottle. So if she woke up like she was prone to, she would need her mother for food because we were breastfeeding. This was when the issues started. We politely declined, telling them in the most sincere way possible we weren't comfortable with that. From the kitchen, we can hear Monster getting aggravated. She starts to roll her eyes while cooking or something, saying how they are more than capable of handling a baby, and I would need to cut the umbilical cord sometime. I remind you, I was not even 3 weeks out from my very first pregnancy. This crazy lady was already telling me that I should just start handing my baby over to people when I had no logical reason to do so. We were short on gas, they had no supplies, and if none of that mattered, the least that she could do was think about my emotional state at that time. I am a first-time mother who has never been away from her daughter. It wasn't easy for me to just hand my baby off, even to someone like my Phil, who I trusted with my life. Monster even brought up how she refused to let anyone watch her child for the first 10 years of her life when it was her very first pregnancy. So trying to berate me for not wanting to leave my daughter within the first, not even 3 weeks. Get over yourself, you selfish so. If that wasn't bad enough, my husband's comment threw her over the top. Trying to keep the peace, he politely informs her that no one on either side of the family has watched her yet because she is so young. He even added how my parents haven't even gotten to watch her yet. Hearing this, she blew up. Suddenly, she starts shouting and throwing dishes into the sink left and right, hollering, "Why does it have to be a competition?" My husband was furious at this point and about to tell her he had had enough of her attitude when my Phil just shakes his head. You could tell this was a regular thing between them because Phil looked so tired and didn't want us to make things worse. We left after her tantrum and didn't talk to them for about a week or two. Her messages, we ignored or sent one-worded responses. Now we were having a ton of conversations about what we would have to do. Clearly, she was too overly emotional about everything going on, and she wasn't starting to think straight. And this was also around the second time that I had noticed my daughter getting a rash when we were over their house. So there were clearly things that needed to be discussed. Nothing seemed to be done, however, until the day after Easter. I had prepared for the family to come and take pictures with us professionally at Walmart. Noted, I had asked Monster to join us to multiple things up until this point that she refused to go to, explaining that she wasn't feeling well. So, I brushed her off as usual. However, this time, I invited her and my Phil to join us for these photos with my husband's aunt so we could have both sides join us, and it wouldn't just be my side of the family. We were trying to be inclusive. Monster claimed they had bronchitis the week before and were still taking the medication all week long, so they didn't want to make people sick. Now, I was a medical student. A little bit of information here. After 48 hours of taking medication, you are no longer contagious to whatever they prescribed you for. The only reason you should be concerned is if you are still showing signs or symptoms. This was incredibly upsetting to my Phil, who wanted to be there, and admitted they both felt fine. So come Easter, after she had brought up that she wanted to take professional photos with a friend of hers, this was never mentioned again. I had brought it up and even took the liberty to try and invite Monster's aunt and uncle to the photos. I carefully explained how they weren't feeling well and couldn't make it to the ones I had paid for. So I wanted to invite everyone, including them, because they were family too. She sends this long, entirely out of line text about how I was in the wrong for asking her family about that, saying that I was disrespectful and how dare I ask her family to do that in front of them because they were so embarrassed. At this point, I had had enough stress from this witch, and I will admit happily that I blew up on her. I sent her an equally long message, explaining how I was so sick and tired of her constantly trying to make me out like the bad guy. I was only trying to include them to make them feel like they were a part of the family and how I wanted them around. But all she seemed to do was back out, making some lame excuses about how she was never feeling good. I made sure to include multiple times in the message how she was just the stepmother, and I was just as happy if I didn't have her around if she genuinely felt like my including everyone was such a burden. Note, despite my rage, I was crying to my husband about this the entire time because of the panic attack she had given to me, and he had to leave work early to come care for me. This was the day before the final straw. Until this point, my Phil and Monster had made it quite clear that they didn't mind talking with my husband without me there. To this moment, they had asked to speak with him without me on several occasions. So assuming they would give us the same courtesy, we asked for my Phil to come over to discuss how to handle his wife politely. That wouldn't cause her to blow up. His response sent my husband into a rage, and I was so depressed over the entire ordeal. All these times that they told my husband they wanted to speak with him without me there, treating him like a child who should just listen to his daddy all the time, despite being a grown man. His response broke us. How do you think Monster would feel if I went over there to talk to you without her? My heart shattered. To think, not only had we gone along with all the times they split us up to talk behind my back, and we were perfectly okay with it, but now he was blatantly telling us that he didn't want to do the same because it would hurt his wife's feelings. Seriously, so you are basically telling my husband and me that you don't give one damn about my feelings when you talk behind my back. But it is a big deal to talk to you without your wife present at all times. I was literally in tears, sobbing and driving an hour and a half away to meet up with my husband, the baby in the backseat. I had explained to Dad that we wanted to talk to him about all the things that needed to be discussed before we could move forward. His response was that we were going to lose Monster if we ever told her any of this. I was devastated and actually sent her the first text, trying my hardest to explain without throwing her off. I gave her every detail of what was wrong. Told her my husband and I had set ground rules if we were going to continue this into the future. I mentioned first and foremost that my daughter was having allergic reactions to something in their house, so going forward, we didn't want her over there without one or both of us present to figure out what was causing it. I brought up the fact that I think it was the weed smell because of the reactions I get medically when over at their house, but never outright called her out on it. I also mentioned the dogs and how they were always a mess, and we didn't feel comfortable with her watching the baby without someone there because of the medical problems she kept babbling about. Note, since the beginning of the year, she claimed to have a giant tumor behind her ear that could kill her any day, and she would drop dead. I already mentioned how the dog in her house eats the back of people's heads, and if she were to drop dead, It would basically mean that my daughter is dead too because no one would be there to notice. Considering my father's shift was 12 plus hours long, and my bill no longer there. Despite bringing up all of these, I feel very logical reasons to set some ground rules. She tried to turn it back on us by saying we were just not okay with her smoking weed, a topic that we had mentioned multiple times. We were apathetic about her smoking as long as she kept it away from me because of my allergic reactions. She then proceeded to completely jump over the fact that my daughter was having allergic reactions at all, claiming that she always cleaned the house with bleach before we came over. Note, only once did the house ever even hint of bleach, and not very strong, like she may have wiped the counters. My husband almost took the phone, called her, and told her how done he was at this point. But in comfort to me, he sat beside me as I sobbed in his chest and tried one last alternative to this. I could have very quickly just called it quits since she clearly showed no sympathy or emotion to the fact that my daughter, her supposedly beloved grandchild, was having some pretty severe allergic reactions at their home. But instead, she basically proved that her weed was much more important to her than the family ever would be. I asked her if she wanted to be a part of my daughter's life, to choose a time and place comfortable to her that wasn't their home, and we would be happy to bring her there. Her response sent me into a panic attack, and my husband was so furious, he was about to cut ties with both Monster and my Phil. No, in response to my wanting to be a part of my daughter's life, I can't bond with something being dangled over my head like a carrot on a stick. This was the final straw. We both saw red. The rest of her incredibly long and pointless message meant nothing to me from there. Not only did she tell me that she did not want to be a part of my daughter's life, but now she was also calling my daughter a thing, an object that she didn't see fit to play with because it would no longer amuse her. We were done, and despite my father still being caught up in her web of deranged tales, I somehow managed to convince my husband not to lose contact with him. Thankfully, as proven by the most tragic death in my life, I am a massive supporter of my grandparents. I would die before I let anyone get in the way of my kids being around their grandparents. My own grandfather was the one who taught me to do most of the things I know how to do today. If I ever lost him, which I had, I would be devastated. When we lost him, it was the only time I had ever fallen to my knees in agony and cried harder than I ever have. On his birthday, I spent it silently looking out on the lake we had shared so many memories on. He was not just a person, he was my hero. I can still remember people asking me in school who my favorite superhero was, and my response would be him. So despite all the terrible things that my Phil had been okay with or allowed to happen up to this point, I convinced my husband that we needed to keep him around for my daughter's sake. I convinced myself that if she wasn't around, he would go back to his usual, carefree self and wouldn't become this heartless man that he had grown into. I even thought that he would eventually see the error in her ways and come back to apologize. Thankfully, all of this did come true, but not before a year of heartache. Update 5. So from here, I am sure you can guess where this last piece goes. If you haven't been reading comments, I don't blame you because I write a ton. However, these are the little details that dragged me down from the time that we officially stopped talking to Monster to the BS that happened during her divorce to now. I don't expect any of these to be in any particular order, and as I said, I tried to block a lot of this stuff out, so it may not be quite as detailed as my other stories, but I will give it my best. Also, note, we are still dealing with this woman, considering Phil is currently getting a divorce. So let's get into this. At the start, everyone in the family was still trying to play nice with this woman. However, it should be noted that even if they were playing nice, they were clearly done with her attitude. As for us, we thankfully only had one physical time we had to deal with this woman, but neither my husband nor myself acknowledged her. We continued to talk with my husband's aunt and grandmother regularly, and when my Phil was out and about, I would give him as much time as we could spare with her. Now here is where things started getting hilarious. So remember last time how I told you all about the severe panic attacks that hit my husband coming home from work? I spent those next 3 days in and out of the hospital because of the trauma this entire incident had put me in, and I never once asked for their sympathies because we were just done. But here is the kicker. So, at one time, while visiting my Bill, we obviously talked it out with him about how we felt about the entire situation. We didn't think anything of it until a couple weeks later when we get a text from Phil. Apparently, Bill told them about what we talked about, and it had Monster crying all over the back porch. My husband was so mad that my Phil even suggested that we feel pity for her when she was the reason this entire argument started in the first place. Not to mention he had to sit there with me while I was in and out of the hospital for the state she put me in. After all the terrible things she had said and tried to cry fountains over, and she was trying to call for sympathy. He didn't have it. His only response was something along the lines of, "You guys didn't seem to care when you made my wife cry for days straight, and I had to stay home from work because of it." Phil tried to make up something about how he really did feel bad, but it wasn't nice of us to go around saying things like this. My husband didn't respond, and yet again, we went the longest time without speaking to this woman. We continued to try and convince Phil that he should come over to his mother's house to see the grandbaby. Now here is the kicker. A few things here. When we did have these meetings, I made sure that whether I was there or not, that husband never leaves Phil alone with the baby. I was so petrified about what this woman was lying to him about that I feared she would actually have him steal our baby, just to go against our wishes that we never wanted her in our life anymore. There were even occasions where she would try to set up play dates with my daughter and then make them at their house, despite knowing we would never bring her there. My husband only did this on 1 or 2 occasions, and she said she wouldn't be anywhere near them but was stalking them from the living room window to watch everything. My husband never entered the house and refused to let our daughter near the door for fear of allergic reactions, so they stayed on the open front porch. Another big issue was when my Phil tried to come together with my husband. He brought up many of their concerns about this entire situation. My husband had put his foot down and told Phil that he was the one making a ton of these crucial decisions, and not me, despite Monster proclaiming that he was just following whatever I told him to do. I wasn't there, so I only remember the things my husband told me when he came home. But the biggest thing that irked me was Phil thinking that I was after something in return. I know that Monster and your wife are just looking for an apology that they are never going to get. I sat there apathetic at this point and trying not to break down again. My Phil thought so little of me and clearly saw nothing from our perspective. I even went on to explain to my husband that I didn't want an apology. She thinks she is right, and I don't care about that. I care about how she blatantly disregarded my daughter's needs and medical health to continue smoking her habit. Also, I was upset that when I asked her about what she wanted, she was the one who told me no to anything. But this was also the one time that my Phil learned about the comment she made about our baby. He was 553. You don't call his little girl a thing and get away with it. When he yelled at her for what she said, Monster created another sob story about I didn't mean it like that, and I only wanted to bow myself out of the equation, which my husband and I weren't having even a moment of whatever toxic tea she tried to pour. The question was not if she wanted to back out for a little bit. The question was very clearly this: if you still want to be a part of my daughter's life, then please tell me a time and place comfortable to you, not that house, that you would like to meet, and I will be glad to accommodate that for you. Her response was apparent and very blunt no. At that point, after everything she had put us through, we were officially done with her. I had given her the theoretical choice of scissors to cut her rope or the ladder to crawl back to us. She made her choice, and not a day goes by that I am not thankful for what we did. So a few months pass. Monster makes everything so tricky for everyone. If my Phil was to go anywhere, you couldn't even hint at who would be there. The Monster was so controlling that if Phil said anyone, in particular, would be there that she didn't like, he wasn't allowed to go. There were even messages that Phil showed us after the fact, where he asked permission to see his mother, who lived 1 street away from theirs. The Monster was several years younger than he was. Why did he have to ask permission to go and see anyone? Not to mention if she did let him leave, she would text him the entire time, complaining about something or other, so he would only be there a few minutes before coming home. One such time really frustrated me because obviously, it showed how childish and disrespectful she was. By this time, she was already weaving her lies to everyone, telling them that the only reason we wouldn't let her see our daughter was that she called her a thing. Not valid in the slightest, but ignoring her petty comments regularly because we washed our hands of this devil. So come to my husband's grandmother's birthday. By this time, her attitude with everyone in the family was getting old really fast. The Monster was prone to telling Phil where he could go, who he could see, and control nearly every aspect of his life. Not to mention the fights she had gotten into with my aunt, making her so finished with everything. My aunt planned out and paid for a birthday party for my husband's grandmother, which Monster took all the credit for as usual. So clearly, she didn't want me there but wanted my husband to come with our daughter. 2 things here. My husband's grandmother herself told me that she wanted me there. She even made a comment about how she would rather me be there than Monster in a heartbeat. So going behind Monster's back, as she tried to tell everyone we were doing, she threw a hissy fit in the corner of the room. My husband and I were being polite the entire time and avoided her, and the people who were clearly on her side and did not like us. We weren't starting confrontations, we simply talked with the family. Not only did the main character of this party want me there, but she made a point to invite me herself because she wanted me there so badly. However, during the party, Monster started a big scene. We made it clear to Phil from the start that if we were to make it, she was not to come near my husband or daughter once during the party. He was actually ready to knock her out at this point and didn't want to become violent because of her disgusting display of lies. So again, we avoided her and hoped she would do the same. According to other people we spoke with, she would drag people out into the hall and ask them to make me leave because I wasn't welcome. Enter my superhero aunt to save the day. Not only did my husband's grandmother tell her that she wanted me there, but when Monster pulled my husband's aunt away to ask me to leave, she told her off. Auntie got so offended and told her that I had every right to be there for my grandmother, and I wasn't doing anyone any harm. Angry that no one was sticking up for her at this point, she stormed over to my Phil, who we were speaking with, and I had my husband ignore her as I kept facing away from her with our baby, covering her eyes even so she wouldn't see such a despicable person. The monster angrily asks for the keys and spits out, "I was only going to ask one thing," before storming off. From there on, she kept sending ridiculous messages to my father, blowing up his phone because she forced herself to go home. I never read them personally, but you can guess how bad they were when one of the people who read them looked at my dad in shock and exclaimed how childish and selfish she was being. I repeat that my husband and I never looked at her even once during this thing and spent our time happily making conversation and being there for my husband's grandmother. No one ever asked her to leave, but she threw a hissy fit when no one would tell me to go. She even lied to people and said to them that she was kicked from her own party. We had to leave shortly after that, but it felt amazing to hear that my husband's grandmother didn't want me to go, just because she ruined the party. I have never been more accepted in such a loving and happy home and made it clear how much I would do anything for them in return. Another situation that was starting to bug us was how often she would steal my Phil's phone and text on his behalf, or hover over his shoulder and tell him what he should write to people. We could tell from the start that it was her because of A, how long these texts were, and B, how hateful and spiteful they were. This was further confirmed when my Phil would text back after leaving him alone, repeatedly apologizing for what was said because either she had taken the phone or forced him to type it. One such event was my Phil being in the hospital for stress. Her response was to text my husband and me, blaming us for being in the hospital because we were horrible people. I remind everyone that my Phil was the only source of income because she refused to get a job. All of her constant scamming was getting old and making things financially harder on them. Not to mention he worked 6 days a week for 12 plus hours straight in the medical field. Only after his long shift did he have to come home to deal with this devil shouting and yelling at him for any little thing he did wrong. And then he was forced to take care of the dogs she wanted and clean the mess that she made in the house all day. Not to mention she was utterly controlling when it came to anyone my Phil spoke to. Unless it was someone she knew and liked, he wasn't allowed to talk with them. I am not one to completely throw fault at someone else, and I was sure that this situation between the two households was definitely causing some severe stress, but not the entire reason he was there. So we ignored that comment quite easily, but then this crazy witch threatened us. Her exact words were, "You had better not run into me in a dark alley because you have no idea what I am capable of." So, needless to say, we completely blocked her from our contacts at that point, all except FB, because we were not prone to going to that site often. Even better was later when we told Phil what she said, and she commented about how she doesn't threaten people, she only protects the people that she loves, and proceeded to threaten us a second time. After this, we ignored her again, but her threat physically gave me night terrors, and I found it so hard to sleep. She was crazy enough that she actually tried to buy the house behind ours during the divorce so she could spy on us. It was insane. So after getting so many texts and my husband nearly blew up at this woman for her disgusting threats through his father's phone, he called. I wasn't in the room when this went down, but he told his father precisely what Monster needed to hear at this point. He was sick and tired of hearing her mouth through his phone. He threatened legal actions, and he would block Phil's phone if he didn't stop receiving texts from her. Thankfully, from then on, the messages that came through were from him, and we finally got around to deleting her FB and blocking her entirely. But her first account, after being deleted, she immediately messaged my husband on her secondary, calling him a child and needing to get brave instead of just blocking people. To which we answered by blocking her. So many things came up, but we were fading out of the image. Thankfully, we heard about fights between Monster and my husband's family. She, at one point, tried to call the cops on my husband's aunt and then grew frustrated when my aunt threatened to shut off her phone. The Monster wasn't making payments on the phone, and my husband's aunt was the one paying for it. Not to mention all the threats they had received at the hands of this woman by this time. And I think we can all agree that I would have every right to shut off your phone, just because you were starting drama with me every day. When my Phil would get gifts for the kids, we would check them thoroughly and throw them away if they had any mention or notice of her on them. When I said we kicked this woman out of our lives, I meant it. I even threw away marshmallows she had made and went to the store to buy actual marshmallows instead for fear that she had poisoned them. This was just how terrified she made us that she wanted to hurt us so badly. Another event was for my Mill's uncle's funeral. My Phil obviously wanted to go because the two families were still really close to one another. Obviously, my husband and I wanted to go to support and be there for the family. But when getting there, and my Phil told her the truth that he drove my husband, daughter and myself, she hung up the phone. Talk about incredibly rude and totally disrespectful. This family was still significant to my Phil, and whether she liked it or not, it was insulting to hang up the phone and be unsupportive towards the fact that he was going through a death in the family. When he called back after the funeral, she only berated and insulted me, even going so far as to say I had no right being there just because my Phil and husband were going. I had to take a step back from this comment, like I wasn't there because my husband was going. This was one of the very few times that I asked my husband to go because I wanted to be there for my Mill's sister and their family. It had nothing to do with my husband at all. And the fact that she tried to make me sound like such a sexual deviant, that I would try to make this about making moves on my Phil and husband at a funeral. Even worse still was after insulting me and hanging up on him a second time, she called back crying and boohooing that she was sorry for wounding me, and then went right back to insulting me again like I wasn't in the car, knowing she could hear me. One of the biggest punches was actually from after she started losing her grip on my Phil. She wanted them to have the same lawyer during the divorce, claiming that she was committing fraud yet again and only getting this divorce to rip off the government and get SSI checks. My Phil, at this point, had been so done with her and was okay with the idea of divorce. But he wanted his own lawyer, so one time, he told her that he would be talking with his lawyer at the end of his shift. This deranged woman texted his phone during work over 130 times and called him over 50. When he refused to answer her, she called up his workplace, claiming it was an emergency. Phil's boss pulled him into the office and had to talk with him about what she did, and he was so embarrassed. Well, after this, she tried to get my husband to talk with Phil without me there, so obviously, myself, my husband, aunt, and Phil went to the place specified, where she called him and tried to harass and even threatened him again. My aunt is also very religious, but it was hilarious seeing her flip the phone off repeatedly. But the thing I couldn't stand was the comments she made. She tried to claim that my husband and my kids weren't biologically his. Where did this ridiculous notion come from? Well, a bit of backstory, my brother is horrible with women, and on occasion has gotten caught doing things he shouldn't be doing, making it quite an exciting tale. However, Monster stalked him and his firefighter friends, then told everyone that I was the one sleeping around. I have only ever been with my husband, for the record, and it was a major part of the sleeping arrangement, as I was not having sex until after marriage, or at the very least until he proved he was willing to keep me, so he put a ring on it and we got engaged after almost 2 years of knowing each other. My 2 daughters to this day look identical to him, and he couldn't deny them if he tried. I am confident the last one will have qualities as well, considering how much they look alike. When she commented that she wanted me to take a paternity test to really show who the father was, I even told my Phil I was perfectly fine with that and only had one stipulation. No one else but her was even suggesting this audacity, and I made it clear that if Monster was so sure these kids didn't belong to him, she would have to pay for the tests herself and stop mooching money off of people. Put her money where her fat mouth was. We obviously hear nothing further about this. My husband was utterly disgusted. Not only was it a slap to the face of him, but his entire side of the family, to claim such ridiculous things about us, trying to make us out like we were living some strange TLC live-action show. My husband and I were happy, and she was just jealous that her relationship was not working out from day one. Now, if you saw my previous post with the summary, you know that she lied to everyone about everything. She kept playing it off as the victim and even went so far as to tell one of her now ex-friends that my Phil was cheating with his ex-wife. Said person had no idea she was referring to a dead woman from about 4+ years ago. If that wasn't bad enough, she was also lying about my Phil's family all being part of some strange sex thing. My husband's aunt, grandmother, and any female who came in contact with my Phil were all attracted to him. She spread this lie like butter all over social media. But my favorite one was now that my Phil wasn't listening to her, she was pulling the abuse card. I hope the courts come to see a few things like we have. 1. She was the one convicted of abuse against her husband and children in a previous relationship. 2. My Phil was in a relationship for about 30 years with my Mill, who was half his size and weight before this giant whale, and she never once had any signs of abuse. 3. Funny how all over social media, she never once claimed anything of abuse until after my Phil started to disobey what she was telling him to do. So here is where things kicked the fan hard. She was beginning to run with the abuse card a lot lately, despite all the evidence proving that she would keep him from his family, friends, and closest relationships, proving that she was the one emotionally abusing him, not the other way around. It was even suspicious when my Phil fell down the stairs and through a glass table, so the medics there asked him if she pushed him. The best part, she claimed he laid hands on her and put bruises on her. But remember what I said about my Bill seeing the crap she would do in that house. He was a personal witness to her beating herself into counters and walls all the time to give herself bruises. Now by this time, Phil was genuinely about to lose the house. They tried letting people rent out the rooms and tried more scam deals, but nothing could save them from her incredulous spending habits. So to put this to rest, they decided that Bill would buy the house out from under them, and Phil would live with him while she lived in another place that she wanted. Hence what I mentioned before about her almost buying the house behind ours. Even more ridiculous was her mindset. Because my Phil couldn't keep affording the weed she so desperately craved, she began having huge fits, where she would lay her hands on him and steal his things, then try to claim against it. I had told my Phil a week before this point to get her out of that house ASAP because her next move was to make a fake claim to the police and have him arrested. Our worst fears were realized late one night. My husband's aunt calls my phone. It is past 10, and she is beyond herself. She is so upset. The monster had called the police and claimed domestic violence against my Phil. My husband was so livid. I had to keep him in the house before he did something that would put him in jail himself and make him stay there. So we talked it out, and I told him that this would all be okay as long as we kept our faith. We prayed, and the following day, Phil was out, but not without some severe trauma. She took over his house, wouldn't let him back inside, and he could do nothing about it. The police couldn't help him, all because she flipped her switch for the millionth time. So the issue was this. During the divorce, Phil and Monster were supposed to be separated at all times, as in living separately, not just in separate rooms. According to her therapist, Monster claimed that Phil had to feed her and bring her medication, which we found out later was all lies. She did it to keep him coming around. But Phil slept upstairs and came home, only to sleep it off in his room with the door locked. At one point, she even tried to drill out the lock, like she was a psychopath. But my Phil was too lovely and told us she would never do anything. When she had him arrested, she broke into his room again and sat on the floor. Phil told her time and time again to leave his room. She refused and kept trying to convince my Phil that he needed to call my Bill and tell him not to buy the house. My Phil refused and continued to demand her to leave. So her response was to get up and take his phone for the third time that day without his permission and try to call Bill. My Phil was done with her crap at this point. He grabbed her wrist long enough to take back what belonged to him and told her one last time to leave him alone. But the die was cast. He took hold of her wrist, even for a second. So she called the police. I can still remember this grown man crying like a baby to all of us. He was so scared he would lose his job, hobbies that involved school, and everything he held dear. She ruined his life from there. He was lost, with nowhere to go. So we prayed. I would also like to remind everyone that for a woman so heavily claiming abuse, my Phil refused to talk to her and message her, even going as far as blocking her phone number. From the moment he left court from the jail to this day, she harasses him through email, text, calls, you name it. She even called my husband's grandmother's home phone and left a threatening voicemail for the entire family. At one point in time, she even emailed my Phil, saying that he needed to ditch his family and come see her because she was sexually longing and required him to fulfill her needs. But just like she had done to him, he was no longer talking to her, and the longer it went on, the crazier she got. Monster even tried to do stupid things to jeopardize her life and get my Phil to come to her. One such item was she needed a sharp object to cut something painful off of her skin, and when he refused to answer her, she found something to do it instead and claimed that days later she was getting sepsis. For those of you not sure what that is, life-threatening infections can happen when you allow bacteria to enter the bloodstream. Basically, she had given herself this disease to force a reaction out of my Phil, then continued to claim that he was abusing her by not coming to take care of her. She did this a lot too. After putting him in jail, she would email or text him, telling him that he was so abusive towards her because he wouldn't go out and buy her food, and they didn't have any at the house. My favorite being the lie she made up when the utilities would start getting shut off. She claimed that Phil was doing it on purpose to abuse her. My Phil had no money because of her. He couldn't pay anything if he tried. From my perspective, I see no reason to pay for utilities in a house that you weren't staying in. She tried everything she could to get rid of him in that house, and now she couldn't afford to keep it. So she was making him out to be the villain in her story. She would even post terrible lies that my Phil was preventing her from buying her new house. Note, she only didn't get her money because they had agreed that the money to buy the house would come from her portion of the profits made when selling the house she was sitting in to my Bill, which she refused to do. She even tried to post how terrible a person my Phil was, all because he was mad that I put him in jail. Slight poll here. How many of you would be peaky keen on your spouse if they put you in jail? Whether you actually deserved it or not? Didn't think so. So all these lies and crap started, and she continued to make up claims even after my brother bought the house, which we have proven time and time again she was lying about. However, this is where the story comes full circle, and the thing that made me despise this woman more than anything in the world. I told you all in the very beginning how I was there to witness the downfall of my Phil. I don't care if you have ever seen the most significant heartbreak in your life. This man was 100 times that. I watched him hit the floor and emotionally drown. I watched the guilt sweep everything he knew under the rug and rip him away from reality in seconds. This was a man who married his best friend. They grew old together and spent nearly every waking day together. I don't think my Phil can recall a single moment in his life that made him happiest than with my Mill in it. In the quietest of times and the darkest of days, you can see how hard it hit him. The monster was never there. She couldn't see the emotional damage, the pain, the suffering this man endured, having to move on with his life, without his wife there to share it with. She took all these emotions that he tried to pour out to her for support or guidance, and did the one thing that I will never forgive her for, ever. We were sitting in the living room as he read one of her many emails through to the very end. She had even sent a copy of this over to her lawyer. The biggest lie that ever made me want to punch a chick in the throat 1,000,000 times. It was when she falsely claimed that my Phil killed my Mill. She explained that he left her there to die, knowing she was gone. She wasn't there. She did not see the shock and disbelief on this man's face. She had no right to ever bring her name into this and savagely taint her. My Mill was a fantastic person, and even writing this has me in absolute tears. My Phil had no idea that she was gone. No man, no matter how talented at acting, they could never show that kind of pain. Not to mention the reaction that he had, reading that email. He broke into tears, started to panic and flail, remembering the torture he went through. Had all of us terrified that we were going to lose him too. You can't fake pain like that. I will forever hate this woman with every fiber of my being. The last words I will ever say to her is, I pray the devil is kind when welcoming you back.